Hello and welcome to Simon Says Artwork. In this video I'm going to be doing a self-portrait using a brush pen. Now this is a video which I'm doing in a ramp up to a special feature that I'm going to be featuring on this channel soon. So this is in preparation for that, but I thought I'd share this first step with you. I'm basically just going to be taking a plain A4 piece of paper and using some Derwent brush pens, they've got a refillable capsule at the back of them. And I'll show you the brush pens anyway. They're really good. So, okay, let's get started. Okay, so for this video, what I'm going to be showing you is how I started this study. And it's basically using these specific brush pens that I bought quite a few years ago now, and I did used to use them quite a lot, but the ink that I had left, you can see them there in the top left, the ink that was left in the wells at the bottom was still enough to have a play around with, and this is only the first of several drawings that I'm going to do with a brush pen. So okay, let's get started. Now this one I think was labelled 3, and it just means it's the larger of the brushes. You have two pointed brushes and one flat brush. Now because it's been so long since I used them, you can see that I started off by trying to get the ink flowing through the brush in the top right hand corner of the page, and at first it isn't. It's just not coming through because it has been years, so it takes a little while for it to flood through the actual brush, but not too long. And basically I start to mark out certain little pieces because you can see very faint lines there, so I thought I might as well use this as markers to start off the drawing and just get used to what the brush feels like on the paper. Even though the ink isn't flowing through it, you can just feel from the bristles how it is touching the paper. Now I have used a couple of different brush pens in my time. There's a Pentel brush pen that I saw David Mack use. David Mack is an artist who illustrates a comic book called Kabuki. In fact, I think he's the creator of Kabuki, the comic book. And the brush pen that he uses is a very specific Pentel brush pen, which I really like. So I've tried that one, and that one's very different to this. It feels like a nice thin brush, but the ink does just flow through it, and it's got a cartridge included. And I've also used a Pentel brush pen, which is the same type which Kim Jong-yi uses, and that one again is very different, where the ink just floods through the bristles, and you've basically got to move very quickly when you're doing drawings because you've got no time to waste like I'm doing on this, where I can just step through it. So this is a bit more of an easy to use brush because you can see you can mark around a little bit here and there, and it's not bleeding through the page when my brush is constantly connecting with the surface. Whereas if you do this with the Kim Jong-yi brush pen, it will bleed. It will, the page will be flooded with ink, and it'll just bleed through that layer of the page, and it's very difficult to use compared to this. So this is a bit more of an easy to use tool, and I really appreciate these brush pens. They are nice and enjoyable to use, and they're a good starter if you're trying to get used to using a brush instead of a nib. I start off, as most people do, with the eyes and the eyebrows, and those can be quite good markers for the face, but it does depend on how you're drawing a portrait. If you're doing an ink first portrait, then I do think that using the markers for the eyes isn't necessarily too bad. Whereas if you're not doing the an ink first drawing, if you're using a pencil, I quite like to start off with drawing the forehead, not the top of the head with the hair, but just the forehead shape, because that can really create a large surface area which you can build the rest of the proportions of the face from. Now I'm trying to use this smudge technique, which I don't really do very often, and this is in preparation for a special video that I'm making soon. And so that's what I do throughout this video, is I try to smudge the ink as much as I can, and it's not really working because of how this brush pen works compared to the others that I discussed, where it doesn't really flood enough ink out to make it smudge quite so easily. But it is definitely a fun tool, and that's why I'm trying to make use of the advantages you have with a brush pen that you don't have with a nib. Now with a nib you can't have this variance of line. It just wouldn't do that. You see how thin some of the lines are, like around my nose, and then how fat some of those lines are where I've just made the marks underneath my nose. You couldn't do that with a nib. That would take a lot longer to do. So that was the idea behind using a brush pen, is that you've got certain real advantages that you just can't find in other pens. Getting the right balance for dark and light is something which you'll get used to with practice, and practice isn't just about repeating things. It's also part of the practice should really be to have a critical eye for your own work. Part of what I try to include with this channel is my negative thoughts and feelings about my artwork. Not a lot of people like that, and I'm considering whether or not to not include that, but I thought it would be a real bonus for my channel because not many artists do that, to say this is what's wrong with my work. And I think that's a real advantage for artists to have, to say this is wrong, this is right. And I try to include what's wrong with my work. And there's always things that are wrong with it. And it's not necessarily putting yourself down or saying that you don't like the work. It's trying to have that critical eye to evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of your own practice. And I think that's a really good thing to do. So with this now, I'm really trying to get a balance of the proportions for my own face. And it's tricky because it's been a while since I've done a self-portrait, but you've got to try and be brutally honest. It turns out this portrait turned out a bit more masculine and handsome than I actually am, so you'll have to forgive me for that. That is the rose-tinted glasses that you look through sometimes. But there we are, I did try, and I'll be doing plenty more of these, whether it's self-portraits or just portraits, and also drawings of lots and lots of other things with a brush pen very soon, and uploading that video because I'm already starting to work on it and investing in the studies that it's going to take to achieve the video that I really want to upload and share with you. So this was the first study out of the bunch, and I can imagine this will feature as a time lapse in the video that I'm discussing. So I thought if I show you in real time how I draw it, then you can see how long it takes for me to do a brush pen self-portrait. And it may feel like it's taking a while, but to be honest, it's not that long because you cover such great distance because of the brush being much fatter than a nib. So you can see all of this here may as well be a big fat marker pen because of the amount of space you can cover. And that's a mistake that I make there. I broaden the length of my beard, which is not accurate. And there's several things where I've made proportional errors, but at the end of the actual completion of the image, it's just trying to serve an interesting piece more than it is trying to be photorealistic. I'm not a big photorealist artist, and I'd rather have something which looks quite nice than something which is, photo accurate. So I'm not being too hard on myself when I say that, I'm getting certain proportions wrong. I think that the drawing's quite nice and I do like it, even though the likeness is off. But there we are, that's just part of the truth of doing drawings like this, and in the future I am going to try and be more accurate. But I never want to do caricatures, I don't want things to be too enlarged and inflated, so I try to make sure that it's there's a certain balance with the features, to make sure that the eyes aren't too big, or I haven't enlarged my nose or my forehead due to any kind of, knowledge about, I know that this is quite big, or I'm self-conscious about this part of my body, or whatever it is, can make you hyper focus on certain aspects of what you look like and then draw them inaccurately. So as much as I haven't done them accurate on this drawing necessarily, they're closer than what they'd be if I really let my inner demons speak to me, which I'm not letting them do, because you've got to accept what you look like and just try to be happy with it. So that was part of the impetus behind trying to restrain my inclination to enlarge certain features. Here I'm trying to do certain directional strokes to show that my hair at the front curls round a little bit, but then it also sweeps backwards because I do have it in a ponytail. And a friend of mine, when she saw this portrait, she said that I have softer features than what I'm showing on this portrait, which is quite an interesting note. So I'll try to consider that next time. Now if you look at that neckline, as far as the V-neck which I've drawn in, it's because I'm wearing a V-neck jumper. And that's quite an interesting shape to remember in case you're drawing from imagination. This is me trying to use that smudge method again. And what happened was it caught the eyelid and it brought that up as if I had some kind of makeup. So I had to try and fix that. That was a mistake that happened whilst I was trying to smudge a bit of shadow into that side. So that's just trying to now hide a mistake which happened. So what I did was I applied a bit more shade into the hair to make wet ink something which I can dip with my finger, but the ink dries really quick, so instead I have to keep applying more wet ink to that part so that I can try to smudge some more bits of shadow shapes onto my face. Now the problem which I have is that it's going to start looking like bruising, which is what someone else said to me when he saw it. Another person said to me, it looks like you've fallen off your skateboard, which is true, quite funny. But yeah, what I'm attempting here is shadow. So that's something which I need to try and figure out, is how to actually apply this smudging a bit more effectively and to not make it look like bruising. But it's a process, so perhaps it's because I didn't fully follow through with this smudging technique, because it is just a case of applying shadow to the whole of a side of your face instead of just aspects there where it does look like specific parts of bruising. And that's just something which happens. It's quite tricky, but I do more than what you see there. I definitely add more to it because that doesn't look right. It doesn't look like shadow, but it still isn't quite as effective as it needs to be. Now this part here which I'm trying to add is shadow that is on this side of my face, and so I'm trying to distinguish that from the beard shape. I don't want it to be just another black shape coming off. I want it to be a smudgy shape so that it's easy to differentiate between hair and shadow. And that's a tonal difference, but it's also going to be a textural difference, because if you smudge, it has this fingerprint and this smearness to it which you don't have with the brush, which is a clean sweep, and it's a lot of nice kind of liquidy strokes that happen with the brush pen, which don't happen when you smudge with your fingers. So that is a good way to differentiate between shadow and just marks. But it's tricky. It's very tricky. I'm not good at it yet, but it's a technique that I'm trying. It doesn't hurt to keep adding black to these areas, because I'm not doing it to the top of my hair. That's not where I'm adding black to create wet ink to dip my finger into. And the places which I am adding ink is either on the left hand side of my hair where shadow would be, or on the bottom of my beard where the shadow would be also, which is good because that should be a blacker area than the other side as well, and it adds to the drawing that those are darker. Now I start to do the ponytail behind my head, and I immediately get the stroke wrong, but I just do another one, and then I start to add wisps of hair, but not too many, because I know that it's going to be a shadow shape more than it is going to be something where you try to create all of the strands of hair and that illusion where you have light shining on it. Instead of that, I'm just going to leave a light shape at the top and a shadow shape for the main mass of the... It's not a ponytail so much as it is a... what do you call it? A bun type of thing. But because my hair's so long, the bun kind of droops and hangs low. So that's what I'm sort of drawing there. It just looks like a strange... I don't know, ball of some kind coming off the back of my head. And I try to create a shadow shape on the lower side of that. Now I accidentally drop the brush pen, which means that now I can't leave the neckline. I've got to create some kind of shape for the jumper that I'm wearing. First I think, should I just do shadow shapes for the creases in the jumper, or should I do the whole dark jumper on top and just brush it all in? And I wait for a moment to see how it sits with me and how it looks. Create a bit more shadow in the beard, in the place where it doesn't really hurt, and then try to put a bit more shadow under my nose in specific places that are going to be effective. So that's quite a nice little shadow on that side of my nose. And then continuously add ink to this area so that I can use it as a dip for my finger to smudge a bit of shadow around the face. And in the meantime, just leaving this mistake on my jumper, leaving it as it is with the shadow crease, so that I can decide, how does this sit with me, how does it look, am I happy with that design, and do I need to change it and make another decision to try to serve the drawing. Because that's the most important thing, is not how do I leave it the most minimal, it's how would I like the drawing to look. So I wasn't happy with it just as a shadow shape, so I thought maybe I should draw the jumper a kind of, a bust, like you see for a sculpture. You'll see a bust of certain historical figures. I thought if I just do, the head and part of the shoulders, that's a bust. And then I'm doing a little bit more of a shadow shape, and I'm trying to negotiate what's going to look right and what isn't. But it's also a nice way to spread the bristles of the brush and see what happens when you really have a large area to spread out the brush and see what happens there, because I'm learning what this looks like again when I'm using the brush. It's not something which I'm not very used to. So what I end up doing is, instead of using all the ink up in this brush, I end up putting the cap on this one and then getting another brush out to use for the ink in another pen. So this one's the flat tip brush. Now you probably wouldn't have known if I didn't tell you, but that's what I've just done. I've changed it for the flat tip brush, and it just means that instead of having a point, it just has an edge, and you can see it there at the top. And this is why I'm using it for hatching as well. It's a very good brush pen for hatching, because it's you can do light delicate wisps with it, and it's basically flat on one side, and you can hatch away to try and get a little bit of shading. And I was struggling to do this smudgy shading, so I thought I'm just going to hatch to try to create a sense of shadow, but it still does look a little bit like I have an injury, which is not the intention. Now I get the smaller brush, but that one really the ink wasn't flowing through it. As you can see, it was really struggling. So much like the wider brush that I've done for this drawing, the smaller brush just needed more time for the ink to flow through it. So instead, what I do is I go back to the flat brush, because I'm covering more space with that, so I just need to cover that. But for the time being, because this is so wispy, I thought maybe I can use this partial ink coverage coming from the small brush to get a bit of shadow on my drawing as well, because if it's not completely flooding through the brush, then maybe I can use it to increase this shadow surface on this plane of the face. But it wasn't really especially effective, so I ended up abandoning it and going back to the flathead brush. But there's a little bit of shadow I can add to the lip there, and that is a very delicate area to add shadow to, and bits on the nose. So I'm trying to capitalise on how much this brush is dry at the moment, and it's got a little bit of very, very light grey pigment coming through. And I thought if I can use that in more sensitive areas, then it's served a function which the other brushes can't really do at the moment. So that was how that one became useful. Trying to shape the nose so that you've got, certain shadow shapes defining that surface is always quite interesting and useful to me. So that's what the smaller bristled brush was being used for. They do have caps on them, which at the back of the well, at the back of the nib, you can pop the nib on the back. You can see it there. If you can see the very tip, the other end, that's the cap of the brush pen. And Peter Draws calls it posting, when you can put the cap on the other end of the pen whilst you're using it. he calls it posting, and I think that's quite a good word. I don't know if it's the correct word or not, but I'm quite happy to use that just as he does. So to post the cap on the pen is quite a useful feature as well on these brush pens, because initially it doesn't look like it can. If you can see the tip there, there's no cap on the tip and it looks like it wouldn't fit, but it does. It just pops on the end. It's a very small feature, but to me it's very valuable. And that's how it turned out. Got a very smudgy middle finger. Got the 3 brush pens that were each of use. It's not spot on, but it's at least something interesting, and it's a start to these studies. Okay, that's the drawing done. I thought it worked out quite interesting, even though it's not the best likeness, it's not the worst, but it's kind of, you know, somewhere in between. Let's see. There. There. Like that. Anyway, the point being, I quite liked some parts of it. I thought it was quite an interesting thing. I tried to get some smudgy texture for the shadow on the side, but you know, that's a bit experimental at the moment. I'm going to work on that. I just thought it'd be worth sharing because it's a nice healthy practice to try and use a brush instead of a nib. It just makes your markmanship a bit more disciplined, because the brush can be a little bit more unwieldy, especially when it's a real brush and not a nib. But there we are. That was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you know what to do. Leave a like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next video.